I want you to think about a time you tried to radically change a habit. Or, you know, maybe you had a front row seat watching a company try to completely shift its culture.
Oh, right. Everyone knows that drill. You read the best-selling books or you download those premium habit tracking apps.
Exactly. You throw out all the junk food, or if it is the corporate world, you print out those shiny new mission statement posters, right?
Yeah, and you stick them in literally every conference room.
And for a week, maybe two, if you were lucky, it actually works.
But then, like a month later, you look around and realize you have snapped back into the exact same rut.
Right. The diet is dead, the corporate culture is as toxic as ever, and you are just left wondering why change always feels like like you are fighting gravity.
Well, it feels like a physical law because, according to the research we are diving into today, it essentially is one.
Wow, really?
Yeah, you are dealing with this massive gravitational pull right back to your system's baseline. We are so conditioned to blame a lack of willpower when we fail. But this material argues that failure actually isn't about effort at all. It is purely structural.
Which really is the core mission for this deep dive. Today we are unpacking a really fascinating stack of proprietary frameworks from the Spectrix Metaphysical Institute.
Yes, specifically, we are looking at something called the Blueprint Nucleotide Architecture.
Or BNA for short. And this was created by Dr. Carlton Johnson. They call him Doxy in the text, right?
Right, Doxy Johnson. And our goal is to decode his master meta-model. We want to discover how treating human behavior and even business strategy as these structural systems can actually unlock permanent change.
Because just relying on sheer motivation or clever tactics obviously isn't working.
No, it definitely isn't. And the reason our attempts at change feel so frustrating is that our current maps for fixing problems are just fundamentally flawed.
Okay, how so?
Well, the BNA framework points out that most of the toolkits we rely on are completely fragmented.
So, we all have our go-to models for problem solving, right? If you are running a business, you might use something like Michael Porter's value chain to figure out where your margins are bleeding.
Sure, or if you are trying to fix a personal behavioral issue, maybe you turn to cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT.
Yeah, CBT. But the BNA Meta-Model paper argues that whether you are analyzing a massive enterprise or just a single human being, these standard models only describe the behavior within a system.
Exactly. They never actually define the underlying architecture that is generating that behavior in the first place. The text actually refers to these existing disciplines as partial expressions.
Partial expressions, what does that mean exactly in this context?
Think about cognitive behavioral therapy. It is a wildly successful and effective model, obviously.
Yeah.
But according to this framework, it primarily covers the processing and behavior layers of a human being.
Right, it maps how your thoughts affect your actions.
Exactly. But what it misses is the complete sequential architecture that surrounds those thoughts and actions. It doesn't map the entire blueprint.
Oh, I see.
And the same goes for business strategy models. A framework might map competitive constraints or value creation perfectly, but it completely fails to account for the stabilization layer of the entire company.
Meaning it can't explain why a company structurally defaults to a toxic culture, even if they have a great business strategy on paper.
Exactly right.
It is kind of like trying to fix a leaky pipe by constantly painting over the water stain on your living room wall.
Oh, that is a perfect analogy.
Yeah, it's like we obsess over the symptom,
Let's
the
go
water
further.
stain, because it is visible and it is annoying. So we buy better paint, we try different rollers, but we never actually tear open the drywall to examine the actual plumbing.
That is exactly how Doxy Johnson would frame it. The core philosophy of the Blueprint Nucleotide Architecture is that systems do not produce outcomes randomly. They reproduce them structurally.
Okay, so symptom-level approaches are just doomed from the start.
Right. Painting over the water stain or, downloading a new productivity app, those fail because they completely ignore the architectural source of the pattern. The system itself is intricately designed to keep producing that exact same water stain.
Okay, so if all these established models are just high-end paint for water stains, what does the actual plumbing look like?
That is where the framework introduces this idea of a scale-invariant architecture, and it draws heavy inspiration from biology. Specifically, Dr. Johnson looks at the DNA double helix.
Like actual human DNA.
Right. The proposition here is that value-generating activities in any system, whether that is a massive corporate entity or just a human being, They operate just like genetic nucleotides.
Which, just as a quick refresher, nucleotides are the basic building blocks that sequence together in a specific order to create life in biological DNA.
Exactly. So in the BNA Meta-Model, there's this universal processing sequence that acts as the genetic code for how a system produces literally any output. And the crucial point about this sequence is that it is invariant.
Meaning it does not change.
Right. It remains the exact same, regardless of the organism.
Okay, let's break down that sequence. The research lays it out like this input, which leads to processing, which leads to activation, producing an output, which finally leads to stabilization.
Right, those 5 steps.
Input, processing, activation, output, stabilization. That 5-step sequence is presented as the universal DNA of how anything happens.
And this is where the framework introduces the BNA translation tables. So the governing structural logic is constant, right? But the actual expression of those 5 steps changes depending on the context.
Okay, walk me through an example of that. Let's start with the business.
Sure. If we look at an enterprise, the input layer is market data. The processing of that data is the strategy.
Makes sense.
Then the activation layer, which is the energy that drives the action, that is the corporate culture. The output is the actual operations. And finally, the stabilization layer is the brand. The brand stabilizes the company's place in the broader market.
Okay, hold on. I need to pause here because I am struggling with this scale and variance concept.
I know, it sounds a bit out there at first.
Yeah, because you are comparing a multi-billion-dollar corporation conducting global market research to me, an individual person deciding whether or not I want to go to the gym. That feels like a massive stretch.
Right.
How can a corporate brand and a human being's internal state possibly be the exact same structural thing?
It definitely sounds counterintuitive until you look at the human expression in those translation tables. Let's map those exact same 5 steps to a person.
Okay, let's do it.
For a human, the input is perception. It is whatever you notice in your environment. The processing is ju, meaning how you internally interpret what you just noticed.
Okay.
Then the activation is emotion. That is the neurochemical energy that drives you to respond. The output is behavior.
Yeah.
And that final stabilization layer, that is identity.
Oh, wow. So market research and human perception are functioning as the exact same structural nucleotide.
Exactly. They're both just the input mechanism gathering data before passing it down the chain.
So the scale of the organism changes entirely, but the physics of the system are identical. That is a really wild way to view the world.
It is, but it explains so much about human behavior.
Well, since our goal today is to figure out why individual change is so incredibly difficult, let's zoom in specifically on the human application. The sources refer to this as BNA2, right?
Right. BNA, Roman numeral 2.
We need to look at that final step in the sequence, stabilization. Because for humans, you said that is identity.
Yes. And to fully grasp why identity is so unyielding, we have to visualize what the text describes as the double-strand architecture of the human system.
Okay, how does that work?
So imagine that core sequence we just discussed. Perception, meaning emotion, behavior.
Yeah.
Imagine that as a vertical chain running straight down the center. But it does not exist in a vacuum. It is flanked by supporting strands on either side.
Okay, so picture a ladder. You have the rungs in the middle and 2 long rails holding everything together.
That is a perfect visualization. On the internal side of that ladder, you have your cognitive framework and your physiological state. So your conscious beliefs and your central nervous system.
Got it.
And then, on the external side, you have your environment and the raw inputs or information you consume. But running straight down the absolute center of all of this, acting as the primary stabilizing strand, is identity.
It dictates the operational boundaries of your entire system.
Right, and this setup creates what the framework calls the replication loop.
Which is a closed circuit, basically.
Exactly. It continually feeds back into itself. Your identity dictates your perception, which dictates the meaning you assign to things, which creates the emotion, which drives your behavior.
And then that behavior creates a confirmation of that exact same identity. You are just constantly proving to yourself that you are exactly who you think you are.
Yes. And we really have to define what identity actually means in this context, because it is not what most people assume.
Right. It isn't just your title at work or whatever.
No, not at all. There is a crucial quote from the text that clarifies this. It says, "Identity is not who the system says it is. It is what the system consistently reinforces."
Oh, that is a punch to the gut.
It really is. You might tell everyone at dinner that your identity is a healthy, disciplined marathon runner. But if your system consistently reinforces sitting on the couch eating chips every evening, the couch potato behavior is your actual structural identity.
Because the system does not care about your aspirations at all.
Not one bit. The reason change feels like fighting gravity is that the system actively resists anything that is incongruent with its established identity.
The thermostat analogy feels perfectly engineered for this.
Let's hear it.
Let's say your structural identity is set to 68 degrees. If you try to aggressively change your behavior without fundamentally altering your identity, like, say you go on a severe restrictive crash diet, you are basically just opening a window in the middle of winter.
Right, the room gets cold for a minute.
Exactly, and you think you are making progress. But the thermostat immediately senses the temperature drop, and it doesn't care that you want the room to be colder. It kicks the furnace into overdrive to force the house right back to its 68-degree baseline.
That is exactly it. Any behavior that falls outside the boundaries of your current identity creates what the framework terms structural tension.
And the system hates tension.
Oh, it despises it. The system is mechanically designed to resolve that tension by reverting to prior familiar patterns. It is literally a survival mechanism.
Okay, so if identity and the replication loop are running constantly, operating like a furnace, forcing us back to our baseline, how do we ever actually break the loop? Because if willpower doesn't work, what does?
Well, we have to locate the glitches inside the architecture. The framework identifies these glitches as structural distortions.
Structural distortions.
Right. The system stabilizes whatever is reinforced, even if the pattern is completely flawed or genuinely harmful to the organism. It doesn't judge whether a pattern is healthy or destructive. It only cares if it is familiar.
And the research lists several specific distortions, and honestly, they are painfully relatable.
They really are.
There is perceptual bias, which happens at the input layer. This is when your system constantly over-indexes on threats or limitations. Like you walk into a crowded room and your perception layer only highlights the one single person who happens to be frowning at you.
Yep. Completely ignoring the 10 people smiling.
Exactly. Then there is interpretive drift, where your meaning layer defaults to a catastrophic interpretation. So a friend takes 3 hours to return a text, and your meaning layer immediately decides, well, the friendship is over. They hate me.
And then there is behavioral echo.
Right.
That is where you keep repeating old habits even when your intentions have genuinely changed. You deeply want to be calm during an argument, but you find yourself yelling anyway.
Because the echo is just baked in. So how do we fix these distortions?
To fix them, BNA introduces the concept of adaptive response units, or ARUs.
Okay, ARUs.
These are structurally targeted interventions. But you cannot just deploy them randomly and hope for the best. There are very strict rules governing how they work.
Let me guess. It has to do with the layers.
Exactly. The first rule is layer correspondence, meaning the intervention must match the exact layer where the distortion is actually occurring. The second rule is depth-first sequencing.
Depth-first sequencing, meaning you go deep before you go shallow.
Right. That mandates that you must address the deeper layers like meaning or identity before you even attempt to change the surface behavior layer.
Okay, let's ground this in a specific scenario. Say I have a terrible pattern of chronic procrastination.
Very common.
Right. I have a big project due, and I just put it off until the night before. Now, conventional wisdom tells me I need to increase my discipline. Or maybe I should download a fancy new time management app that blocks social media on my phone.
Well, the classic behavioral fix.
Yeah. But according to BNA, that app is a virtually useless ARU. Because it only targets the behavioral layer, completely ignoring the meaning or identity layers that are actually causing the delay in the first place.
Right.
Using a habit tracker to fix a core identity issue is like trying to change the direction of a rushing river by rearranging a few pebbles on the surface. The current underneath is just going to wash your work away the second you turn your back.
That is a phenomenal way to put it. Because if your underlying identity is configured around a deep-seated belief that your worth is tied to producing absolutely flawless work.
Like a perfectionist identity.
Exactly. Then your meaning layer is going to interpret any potential mistake as a literal catastrophic threat to your survival.
Oh.
So when you sit down to start the project, your system activates massive anxiety at the emotion layer. The resulting behavior, which is procrastination, is actually a perfectly logical output.
Wait, really? Procrastination is logical?
To the system, yes. It is the system successfully protecting you from the perceived threat of imperfection. If you don't start, you can't be judged as flawed.
Oh my gosh.
So rearranging pebbles with a time management app doesn't touch the depth where that distortion actually lives.
There was a case study in the notes that perfectly illustrates this. It focuses on a pattern called inconsistent execution.
Right, the initiator case.
Yeah, it describes a person who constantly starts ambitious projects, gets incredibly excited, buys all the gear, and then inevitably abandons the project a few weeks later. Normally, I would look at someone doing that and just assume, well, they are lazy or they lack focus.
But the BNA structural analysis diagnosed him completely differently. When the practitioners ran an analysis on this individual, they found that his identity was deeply configured around the archetype of the initiator, or the seeker.
He saw himself as the brilliant ideas guy, the person who was always on the cutting edge of something brand new.
Exactly. Meaning the inconsistency wasn't a failure of the system at all. It was actually structurally congruent with his identity.
Because if he actually finished a project, he would transition into a manager or an operator. He
Yeah.
wouldn't be the searching, initiating ideas guy anymore.
Which means finishing a project was an existential threat to his established identity. The system abandoned the projects on purpose to force him back to the starting line, where his identity felt safe and validated.
So you don't just give this guy a daily planner and tell him to try harder.
No, that would violate depth-first sequencing.
Right, you have to go deeper. The ARU protocol in the text talks about doing an identity expansion. You have to help him realize that his identity doesn't just have to be the idea guy. He can integrate the executor archetype alongside the initiator.
And once he genuinely believes that about his own identity, finishing the project is no longer a structural threat.
And then you move up to his cognitive framework. You replace his perfectionist, idealized standards with iterative, completion-based standards.
Yes.
Finally, you redesign his environment so he is actually rewarded for following through rather than just getting dopamine hits from announcing new ideas to his friends.
It completely reframes self-sabotage, doesn't it? The person isn't broken. Their architecture is just functioning perfectly to protect a very specific blueprint.
It changes everything. And there is another case study in the material that takes this even further, dealing with relational withdrawal.
Oh, yeah. This applies to someone who constantly pulls away right when a romantic relationship or a deep friendship starts getting close.
I mean, we all know someone like this, or maybe we have even been this person. Things are going great, intimacy is building, and then suddenly they pick a fight over nothing. Or they just ghost the other person entirely.
And conventional psychology usually slaps a fear of commitment label on it and calls it a day.
But the structural insight here offers a completely different mechanical explanation.
Right. In this case, the individual's primary identity stabilizer is autonomy. Somewhere along the line, their system learned that absolute independence is the only way to remain safe.
Okay, so their identity requires total autonomy.
Yes, and because of that, their perception layer structurally encodes relational closeness as an incoming threat. The system withdraws not because they don't care about the other person, but because the system is deploying a defense mechanism to protect the autonomy that keeps their identity stable.
It is the thermostat again.
Exactly.
The relationship gets warm, the system panics because the baseline is supposed to be cold and isolated, and it kicks on the air conditioning by starting an argument to create distance.
And if you want to intervene using an ARU, you cannot start by just telling them to behave better or to text their partner more often.
Because that violates depth-first sequencing.
You got it. You have to address the meaning layer. You have to help the system structurally decouple the concept of closeness from the concept of loss of autonomy. Until the architecture stops interpreting intimacy as a threat, those behavioral withdrawals will just continue to echo.
Man. So what does this all mean for you listening to this deep dive right now? The core lesson from the Spectrix Metaphysical Institute's research is incredibly freeing, honestly.
It is a huge relief.
Lasting transformation is not contingent on how much willpower you can muster, your daily motivation levels, or the external pressure you put on yourself. It requires diagnosing your own structural alignment.
Right.
If you find yourself stuck in a loop, snapping back into that same rut month after month, you need to stop judging your behavior. You aren't lazy, and you aren't broken. Your architecture is just doing exactly what it was built to do.
You have to start auditing your blueprint. Ask yourself what inputs, what meanings, and what environments are quietly confirming your current identity every single day.
And it is also vital to remember the scale invariance of this entire framework, right?
Absolutely. The architecture that governs your internal habits is the exact same architecture that governs massive organizations. The text states explicitly that an organization is essentially just a macro expression of the internal architecture of its leaders.
Which leaves us with a pretty provocative final thought for you to mull over. We constantly see headlines about massive companies collapsing from the inside out due to toxic corporate cultures.
All the time.
So, based on the translation tables we discussed today, consider this. If a company's CEO has a hidden, unresolved relational withdrawal distortion or a massive perceptual bias at their own human BNA level, how long does it take for that individual structural distortion to replicate?
Wow.
How long until it scales up and infects the culture of a 10,000 person enterprise? Are the toxic, dysfunctional corporate cultures we see today just the unexamined identity constraints of their founders, magnified and weaponized at a global scale?
I mean, a leader's unaddressed meaning layer inevitably becomes a company's strategy. Their unexamined emotional imprints become the corporate culture. You cannot separate the human architecture from the enterprise architecture.
So, whether you are trying to fundamentally change yourself or you're trying to change the world around you, remember the plumbing. You cannot just keep painting over the water stain. If you want to stop fighting gravity, you have to rewrite the laws of physics inside your own blueprint.